friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using the brand new Flower Friends stamp set from Hello Bluebird. So I've stamped the images I'll be using on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers. So I'll begin with my lady deer, and for the outer parts of her body, all except for her face, I'm going to be using E50, E51, and E53. So I'm using that E53 first to lay in some shadows on the edges of her ears, also the top of her head and the bridge of her nose, the underside of her little arm there, and then also under her dress and down the sides of her legs. I'm blending that out with the E51, and then I'm coming in with the E50 for my lightest shade. For her face, ears, and neck, I'm going to use those lightest two shades. I did start with the E50, but then I decided to darken that up just a bit with the E51. So I'm just going over the E50, just being a bit more sparing, and then going back to that E50 once again to just blend that out a bit and leave the rest of that white. And then I felt like there wasn't enough contrast between the lighter parts of her body and the darker parts, so I decided to go back in with a second layer on the darker brown parts. So I'm just going back in with that E53 and then the E51 and then the E50, and just adding that color right over top of where I've laid it down previously, just to beef up that saturation a bit. And then I'm using E57 and E59 for her hooves, just a little touch of that E59 and then blending that out with the E57 to fill those in completely. And then I'm going to move on now to the bunny, and I decided to go with a gray bunny. So I'm using W00, W1, and W3 for her. So I'm using that W3 first, and again shading on equal parts on the left and the right. Since these critters are all facing directly forward, I like to keep the highlight on the face, so the shadows are going to go on the outer edges of the body. It's also going to help them look a bit more three-dimensional and pop them off the page a bit more, just bring them more to life. So once I laid in all my shadows with that W3, I began to blend those out with the W1, and then I came in with the W00 to fill in the rest of her. I also did add a little bit of color to the insides of her ears just to help them look a little bit more natural. And I'm leaving a little round white area around her nose and mouth just for something a bit different. And then while I have these colors out, I'm going to use them for the white parts of my fox. I'm just starting with the W1 on these, and then I'm going to finish with the W00 and let that fade into the white cardstock as the highlight. Then I'm going to switch to my orange combo for the rest of my fox, and I'm using my go-to orange combo for foxes, which is YR12, YR14, and YR18. So I'm using the YR18 to add that shading around the face and on the bridge of the nose, which is going to help that nose just feel like it protrudes out a bit more. And then the underside of the hands, also under the skirt and down the legs, and then where the tail is attached to the body as well. And then I'm going to begin to blend that out with the YR14. So just continuing to fill that in, pulling that color into the mid-tone there, and then leaving some white space for my highlight shade, which is going to be the YR12. And again, making sure to really go over the edge of that YR14 with the YR12 so I get a nice smooth blend from color to color. And I wanted to darken up the fox just a little bit and have a bit more contrast. So I added in the YR27 when I went back to do my second layer. So I'm adding that as my darkest now and using that for my shadows, going right over where I had the YR18 previously. and then I'll switch to the YR18 to begin to blend that out. So I'm going to have all 4 shades in the second layer. So once I have the YR18 laid in, then I'm going to come in with the YR14 and begin to pull that back out. But I still want to leave plenty of room for that highlight shade, the YR12, because I want to still keep those nice bright areas, especially around the eyes, so you can really see this adorable fox's personality. There were a couple places where I went outside the lines, so I just used my colorless blender to push that color back over across the line. And then I'm going to move on to my bird, and for that I wanted to go with some minty greens. So I chose G00, G02, and G03. I'm doing my shading on the right hand side for the bird since she's facing toward the left, and keeping that highlight on the face like I mentioned. And then I'm ready to go back and add some rosy cheeks on all of my critters using R000, R11, and R20. So I'm laying in a little oval with the R20 on each cheek. I also filled in the bunny's nose with the R20. Then I'm tracing around that cheek with the R11. And I'll go over it one more time with the R000, which is going to help it really fade into the skin tone. So just going right around that, and that really kind of softens that color up, makes it look like a bit more natural blush. And then I'm going to add a bit of shading into the ears using the R11 and blending that out with the R000. Not using the R20 on those because I wanted to keep it a bit lighter. And I almost forgot to do the bird's cheek, but I remembered just in time and went back and finished that off. Then I'm going to go back to my minty green combo, but I'm going to add a bit more contrast to it by adding in the G000. And I'm going to do the fox's skirt, and I wanted to add some little pleats to the skirt. So I'm drawing in little triangles where that fabric goes up on the bottom, and just kind of, creating like a little bit of a fold there with the fabric. And then going around the edges of that with the G02 and then the G00. And then I'll fill in the rest of the skirt with the G000. And I felt like that still wasn't quite dark enough. There wasn't deep enough shadows for me. So I added in the G05, and I much preferred that. So I just deepened up those shadows even more and did a second layer right over top of the first one. And I like that so much better. So just going over all of those shades. And then this time when I get to the G00, I'm also going to add just a little bit of a shadow right up under the sweater where that would be casting one. Just a tiny bit there for a bit more contrast there. And then using the G000 as the highlight. And then I decided to give her a collar to match as if it were like a whole dress underneath, and then she just pulled a sweater over top. So I used all of those shades once again to color that in with the darkest at the back of the neck. And then I'm going to switch to Y32, Y35, Y38, and the YR27 once again that I used for the fox. And I wanted to give the deer kind of like a mustard toned dress. So I'm using that YR27 for the shadows on that, just real sparingly, a tiny bit up under the lace of her apron, and then a little bit on the undersides of her arms, and anywhere where that apron would be casting a bit of a shadow. And then I'm blending that out with the Y38. Next, I'll bring in that Y35 and continue to pull that color out, just making sure that I still leave enough room for that highlight shade, the Y32, which is really pale, which is going to give that fabric a little bit of you know, a highlight or a sheen to it at the edges. And then I wanted to have that yellow represented somewhere else on the card. So I decided to pick a few flowers to do with these shades. So again, I'm using that YR27 at the center of the flower and then blending out with the Y38. And then around that, I'm going to add the Y35. And then I'm going to finish with that lightest shade, the Y32. And these were looking a little bit more fall toned for my liking, so I wanted to just brighten them up a tiny bit. So I decided to pull in Y11. It's a very pale yellow, but it's a little bit more of a brighter yellow or a fresher, more springy yellow. And I just went over the edges with that Y11 to brighten them up a bit because I didn't want this to look like a fall card. I wanted it to be spring-like. I'm also going to color in the B, and this time I'm starting with the Y35 and then blending out with the Y32 and using the Y11 for the highlight. And I decided to do brown stripes rather than black using E44 and E47. For the wings, I brought in BG10 and just added a little bit of shading at the base. And then I decided to add in the BG11 and go ahead and color in my clouds. So I'm using that BG11 on the underside, just following the scallops and then blending that out with the BG10. And I'm just going to let that fade into the white cardstock for the rest of the cloud. For the deer's apron, I decided to go with some beige tones and have it be kind of vintage looking. So I chose E40, E41, and E42, and I also did her collar to match. So I'm using that E42 first to just lay in some shadows anywhere that they would go, down the left side of her body and at the shoulders, a little bit under those flowers where those would be casting a shadow. And then I'm blending that out with the E41. And then I'll finish with the E40, but I am going to leave some white in there as well because I didn't want it to look dingy. I just wanted to have like a vintage vibe. And then I'm moving on to the bunny's dress, and I wanted to go with like a dusty pink. So I chose R81, R83, and R85 for that. So I'm laying in the R85 on the outer edges, the underside of the sleeves, and then I'm going to blend that out with the R83. And I think this combo is just so sweet and feminine, and I think it went really well with the pale grays and pinks that were already on this bunny. I think it just makes her look so sweet. So I'm filling in the rest of the dress with that R81. And then I did want it to have a bit more contrast, so I am going to go back in with a second layer using that R83 now right over top of the previous shadows, and then pulling in the R83, making sure that I add some shadows where her hands are crossed in front of her body. And then finishing with the R81, but I'm not going to completely cover over the R81 I laid in the first time. I'm going to leave parts of it with just that first layer, so I get almost 4 shades in there. I'm also going to use this combo to color in some of the flowers, so I'm just picking and choosing a few here and there to have with this combo. I picked a lot of the ones that were facing sideways. So I started with the R85 on those and then blended out with the R83, and then I'm using the R81 for the tips of the petals. But I felt like they needed just a bit more contrast, so I decided to pull in the R89 and added a few little touches of that close to the stem, and I didn't even bother to blend that out. But I am going to use this combo for the bunny's collar, so it'll have like a contrasting collar. So I put the R89 toward the back of the neck and also colored in the little button at the front. And then I'm blending forward with the R85, filling in the rest of the button, and then using the R83 as the lightest there. And I of course did a second layer on all of that as well. For the fox's sweater, I decided to go back to some of the beige tones that I'd used on the apron, but not quite so dark. So I went with E40 and E41, just laid in a bit of shadow so it has a nice creamy tone to it, and then blended out with the E40 and let that fade into the white. And then just deepen the shadows with that E41 once again. For the pots, I wanted them to be like terracotta, so I went with E93, E95, E97, and E99. So I actually started with the E97. I had my markers backwards, so I thought I had the E99, but when I went to go blend that out, I realized that the E99 had gotten completely dried out, so that one was just like crusty and terrible, so I'm going to have to replace that nib and refill that marker. And then when I switched them out, I realized I had the wrong cap anyway, so it was the E99 that was having issues. So I just went back in with the E97 and put a second layer of that down right away, since the first one had dried back quite a bit in the meantime. And then I'm blending that out with the E95. And then I'm going to use the E93 for the lightest and just pull that color over toward the right hand side. And then to finish off the rest of the flowers, I decided to go with a brighter pink combo because it was starting to lean a little bit more towards fall shades. So I wanted to pull in something that would really be bright and springy. So I went with RV23, RV25, and RV29, and all of the rest of the flowers looked like they were the same kind of flower, so I decided to do them all with the same shades. So I just put the RV29 toward the centers of all of those flowers and then blended out with the RV25, and then I'm using the RV23 on the outer edges of all of those petals. So I'm doing all the ones in both of the terracotta pots, and then also the ones that are left in the wagon and in the bouquet that the deer is holding. So you could definitely mix this up. I mean, there are plenty of flowers that look similar that come in a variety of shades, so you could really have a lot of fun with this and color all of the flowers to be all sorts of different colors, but I just decided to keep it simple because there were so many details to these images, which I absolutely love. It makes me so happy when I can just color and have fun and just really enjoy all the little, special details of a stamp set. So this one is totally up my alley, but I knew the video was getting kind of long, so I just decided to simplify. And then I'm going to use R89 to dot in the centers of every single flower, no matter what color it was. For the wagon, I decided to go back to some greens, but I wanted to use some different ones than what I had previously used. I wanted to go a little bit darker, so I chose G14, G16, and G29. So I'm using the G29 for the darkest to add in some shadows under the lip of that wagon and on the edges. And then I blend it out with the G16 and then use the G14 for the highlight. And I wanted that to be a bit darker and I wanted the blend to be a bit more smooth, so I did decide to go over that with a second layer. I feel like especially darker colors really benefit from that second layer. And then I'm going to color in all of the leaves. So you could definitely mix this up and do different combos of greens for the various leaves. But again, I was just trying to watch the time now that I was getting toward the end of the coloring, and I know you guys have been so patient already. So I decided to just simplify and color all the leaves exactly the same. So I'm using that G29 to add a bit of color to the base of each leaf. And then once I'm done with that, I'm going to come in with the G16, and some of the leaves I'm going to fill in completely, and the ones that are a little bit bigger, I will save room for that lightest shade. So there is a little bit of variation. Some are a little bit darker than others, but basically they're all the same, just to kind of get it done fairly quickly here. So once I'm finished with that, I am going to take that G14 and just go over the ends of any of the leaves that still had room for that third shade. And then I wanted to add just a touch of green to the stems, but I didn't want it to be too obtrusive, so I grabbed the G12, which is really pale, and just kind of sketched in some more color there to fill in some of those blank areas. So all that's left is the wheels of my little wagon, and I'm going to go back to E44, E47, and E49. Although I will say this was a bit darker, and I probably wouldn't use that E49 in this combo next time. But I did add it, so I added the E49 on the right hand side and in the center, blended out with the E47, and then filled in with the E44. But those were looking a little bit too dark, so I decided to pull in the E43 and kind of color over a bit of that E44 to lighten that a bit. And it did work, and I much preferred that look, so I would probably use those lightest 3 shades. Then I grabbed a black Sakura Jelly Roll pen to go over the eyes of all of my critters. Just makes them bright and shiny and gives them a little bit of a raised dimension to them, so I just think it adds something nice to the card. And then I'm going to trim all of these images out with their coordinating dies. For the background, I've taken a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock and die cut that with the new Nesting Decal mini Slimline dies. I absolutely love these dies and love that gorgeous deckled edge that it gives them. So I'm going to blend on some Distress Oxides to create a background, and I'm using Mowed Lawn and the MFT Drifts and Hills stencil to create the grassy area. So I'm just blending that color on down at the bottom until I get a nice even coverage. And then I'm going to add in some Lucky Clover to darken that up a bit. So I'm going around the edges of that to really emphasize that gorgeous deckled detail. Then I will go back to my Mowed Lawn ink blending tool to just smooth over the transition area between those 2 shades. And I wanted to also add in some splatter detail. So I'm going to press some of that ink onto an acrylic block. I'm using both shades of green, and then I'll add some water to that so I can mix that up and make it a bit more fluid, and then I'll tap that off the edge of the block using a small paintbrush to give me that splatter detail. It's going to help it look like little tufts of grass. So I did that with the Mowed Lawn first, and then I'm doing some in the Lucky Clover as well. So I have a nice variety. Then I removed that stencil and let this panel dry for a bit, and then I'm going to go over the top using some tumbled glass. And this time I'm bringing it in from the top and the 2 sides, and just kind of creating like a nice soft glow there, also emphasizing that deckled edge and leaving a little bit of white space on the horizon line. And then to darken up those edges, I'm going to bring in some Salvage Patina. So I'm going right over the tumbled glass that I've already done, but just not going in quite so far. Just mainly on the top and the 2 sides there, and then I'll go back to the tumbled glass ink blending tool and make sure that everything is nice and smooth there with that blend, still leaving that bit of white space on the horizon so that it has that bit of glow like I mentioned. It's almost as if the sun is back there. And then once I'm happy with that, I'm going to do some more splatter detail. So I'm using that stencil to just cover up the grass and pressing both of those shades onto my block once again. I'll splatter using that tumbled glass first, and then I'll add a bit of the salvage patina. I don't want too much of it, and I want it pretty fine, but it just adds a bit more interest of movement in that background. So I'll let this panel dry completely, and then once it has, I'm going to pop it in my Misty so that I can stamp my sentiment. I'm going to do that in VersaFine Onyx Black ink because this ink lays so well over the Distress Oxides. And I'm stamping out Hello Friend in that beautiful handwritten script. And I stamped that down twice to make sure it was nice and bold. And then I'm going to set this panel aside to dry and work on my card base. I've created a mini Slimline card base out of some Lawn Fawn speckled eggshell cardstock, and I'm stamping on the inside using Lawn Fawn Merman ink. And I'm doing another one of the sentiments. It says, flowers are like friends, they bring color to your world. And then a little trio of bees with a little bee trail. And I stamped that down several times to make sure it was nice and bold because this ink does dry back a bit. I added some foam tape to the back of that focal panel so it'll have a little bit of dimension on the card. So I'm just peeling off those release papers, and then I'm going to line that up in the center, making sure I have equal borders on all four sides, and then press that down into place. And then I can bring in my images, and this time I'm going to start with my clouds because they're going to be behind the heads of some of my critters. So I have one over on the right of that sentiment, and I'm going to put another one over on the left. Next I'll take the deer, and I want to get her down fairly quickly because if I want to adjust the cloud that is behind her, I need to work fast because this glue does dry very quickly. So I wanted to just adjust that a tiny bit so that the little part wasn't like between her ear and her head. I don't know, I just felt like it should be shifted over slightly. And next I'm going to take the fox, and that's going to go over on the left hand side of the card to balance out the deer, and her ears are going to overlap the bottom of that cloud as well. And then in between them I'll have my sweet little bunny with her wagon full of flowers. So that will go right in the center below that sentiment. And then I just have those couple of accessory images left. So the bunny had one little foot that wasn't quite adhering down, so I added a touch more glue under that. And then I'm going to add the other terracotta pot full of flowers next to the fox. And then I have this little bird, and originally I had planned to put her over on the right of the deer, but I ended up deciding to put it between the deer and the bunny. I just thought it looked sweet there. And then I'm going to add that little bee kind of buzzing above the wagon full of flowers. And then all that's left is to add a bit of sparkle. So I'm using some Stardust stickles to just dot into the centers of the flowers, just real quick and easy. It's a tiny little touch, but it'll just add a little something extra when you tip this card into the light. And I also did add it to the bee's wings. But the more I looked at this card, I kept feeling like it needed something right in the center below that sentiment. So I colored and die cut one more cloud, and I'm just going to tuck that behind the bunny's ear. And I feel like that filled in the scene so much better. So there's an up close look at all of the detail and another peek at the inside. If you're watching this video the day it goes live, this is a preview of the brand new Hello Bluebird new release, which will be live on May 21st at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, which is 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time where I am. So stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I have more sneak peeks of the new release coming, and make sure that you check the description bar if you're interested in any of these products. I also have 2 extra videos if you're interested in continuing to watch. Thank you so much again. Have an amazing day. Bye-bye.